Whenever we have a big military conflict, especially if it doesn't go well, we take a breather. And we have to kind of reintegrate the military with society to the point that we are willing to send tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of troops abroad again. So this is the future of American intervention. What we're seeing in Ukraine is a potential model for how the United States will fight wars for the next decade or two. One of the many consequences of the 20 years of the global war on terror is that the Americans, for the moment, are pretty much done. We're not going to be deploying troops in number anywhere in the world as a tripwire or as a major force designed to overthrow a government and remake it into whatever image we see fit. It's bloody. The first part, knocking off the government, that's the easy part, but then dealing what happens with the next day, the next month, the next year, the next decade, that sucks. And as we have discovered, with over 100,000 troops and trillions of dollars of investment in Afghanistan and Iraq, we are left with a broken nation and a nation that is, I don't want to call pathologically hostile, but not very fond about the United States about anything. It didn't work. And so the United States needs a different method. And in that method, the Army is no longer an option in terms of ground deployment. We will use the Army if we are faced with a strategic threat. But regardless of what you say about how we did Iraq and Afghanistan, I don't think any of us really thought of the two countries themselves as strategic threats. There may have been elements within them like Al-Qaeda that required getting knocked off, but to say that that required 100,000 troops, no. The 100,000 troops went to try to reshape the local space so that a future strategic threat would not arise. And in that, the war on terror was a failure. So, Ukraine. Here we have a highly motivated country of about 40 million people who is standing up to a nearly as motivated country of roughly 135 to 145 million. Russian numbers, who knows. And all they require is every bullet and drop of fuel that they need to prosecute a war. So what we're seeing is the United States has identified as a strategic threat, Russia, and is using a local power to fight the war with American technical and industrial infrastructure. So we provide the equipment, and it's more than that. The technical side of things. The United States has the most sophisticated satellite monitoring system in the world. I'd argue it's better than everyone else's combined by a significant margin, probably a factor of 4 or 5. And we are providing time-on-target information for the Ukrainians to launch artillery and rocket strikes on targets that are miles, tens of miles away, and those rockets and artillery shells are hitting within a few feet of where they're aimed at. You can't do that with just the normal equipment. Even if we didn't have kill switches in all of our gear, and for the most part we do, without actively tapping the American satellite and information network, even if the Ukrainians could fire these things on their own, they wouldn't be able to hit the targets that they're hitting. They wouldn't be able to identify them. That requires a degree of American involvement, but not a degree of American involvement in Ukraine. So there's a whole kill chain here. Once you identify the target, you have to get that information to a weapon system that is in range, along with the coordinates and the guidance information, so that weapon systems can actually hit the target. In the past, that kill chain has been measured in hours. One of the many things that we've seen as a result of improved information technology in just the last 3 or 4 years is reducing that kill chain to just a few minutes. And this, when American operators are not the ones who are using the equipment within the end country. This is the model for the future. Taking weapon systems that, for the most part, the United States considers relatively low-tech and relatively outdated, transferring them to a third country that is fighting a war that we find to be in our strategic interests. Now, I'm sure people are going to hear that statement like, oh, of course, the Americans baited the Russians. No, I'm sorry. The Russians required no baiting to launch an imperialistic, fascist, genocidal war. They did that all on their own. This, I would underline, is one of the many reasons why the United States and the Russians have not seen eye to eye since World War II, because their method of fighting a war is just something we find morally repugnant and at least strategically distasteful. Anyway, back to the more important topic. This sort of conflict is something that can be leveraged at scale. At any given moment, there are dozens of operatives within the Ukrainian system that are interfacing with the American equivalents back in the United States or in NATO countries, providing this real-time information and providing roughly 80 to 90% of the technical steps of the entire kill chain. Doing it this way makes sure that the war gets steered in directions that you think are productive and not ones that are damaging to your interests. This isn't World War II. when we were providing the Soviets with artillery and shells and fuel, because they would use them however they felt was appropriate. In this case, if there's a specific tactical target that we don't want the Ukrainians to hit, number one, we wouldn't tell them about it. And number two, we wouldn't provide the tactical information that is required for them to target those things. So one of the very, very few scenarios that I can see where nuclear weapons could come into play in the Ukraine war would be if the Ukrainians decide to cross the border into Russia proper, that they just experienced such runaway success they decided to go for the gold. Well, they can't do that without American gear, and the American gear cannot be used in the way that it's being used in Ukraine right now without active American participation. So we do not need to worry about the Ukrainians getting ahead of themselves unless we decide we want to empower them to do so, and I can't imagine that is going to happen. You can apply this model to any place where you've got a numerically superior foe who has some logistical concerns.
Russian President Vladimir Putin. Russia just threatened nuclear war over Ukraine, again. After first threatening nuclear conflict, then walking back those threats with a government-state opposition nuclear war, Russia seems to be back to the nuclear saber rattling that sparked concerns over Russia's possible plans to use a nuclear dirty bomb last year. On Thursday, Deputy Chairman of the Security Council of Russia Dmitry Medvedev warned that if NATO allies allow Ukraine to defeat Russia, it could result in a nuclear war. The loss of a nuclear power in a conventional war can provoke the beginning of a nuclear war, Medvedev wrote on Telegram. Nuclear powers have never lost major conflicts on which their fate depends, Medvedev continued. The former Russian Prime Minister and President of Russia made the comments at the same time Western leaders met with the Ukraine Defense Contact Group at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. The meeting will allow European leaders and representatives to coordinate their latest plans to send weapons, ammunition, and financial aid to Ukraine. Ultimately, it's down to Russian President Vladimir Putin to decide whether a nuclear conflict is a way forward. So far, Russia has practiced restraint in some respects, depending on your vantage point, switching to older ammunition while they work out how to manufacture new, advanced ammunition and even deploying decades-old tanks. Despite major losses and embarrassing setbacks over the last several months, the Kremlin once relied heavily on threats of nuclear war until the Russian Foreign Ministry issued a statement in November dismissing nuclear conflict as an option. In implementing its policy on nuclear deterrence, Russia is strictly and consistently guided by the tenet that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, the statement reads. It is not unheard of, though, for Russia to reverse course and mislead international powers, meaning that Medvedev's statement could be based in truth. The Kremlin may also be depending on the former Russian president to issue these threats in a way that gives Putin plausible deniability. If the threat is on the table, it may make Western leaders think twice about providing Ukraine with advanced tanks and longer-range missiles and missile systems. At the same time, the Kremlin can save face by publicly declaring opposition to nuclear war. Even in the November statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry, the possibility of a future nuclear conflict was not entirely ruled out, and Medvedev's comments could reflect the caveat outlined just months